Marcus Johnson leaned forward against the wooden bar, the surface polished to a tired sheen after years of restless elbows and spilled drinks. A single overhead bowl buzzed softly, casting a warm amber glow across the old tavern's interior. It was the kind of place you could drive past without noticing. Small, slightly crooked, its chipped siding and aging sign blending into the rural South Carolina landscape. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old leather, stale cigarette smoke that clung to the rafters, and the yeasty residue of beers long gone. The decor was worn but honest. Scuffed floorboards, walls decorated with fading country music posters and dusty animal skulls. There were no flashy lights or neon signs to distract from the simple promise of a quiet drink. Marcus had chosen this particular spot at random, guided mostly by the need to get off the road and gather himself. He'd been traveling alone, driving down long stretches of two-lane highway flanked by fields and distant tree lines. The quiet was what he wanted, craved even. Since returning home from his third deployment in the Army, each mile behind the wheel felt like he was slowly peeling back layers of tension accumulated over months in a combat zone. Here, in this dimly lit bar, he could breathe. He wore civilian clothes now, a simple pair of jeans and a snug t-shirt that revealed sinewy arms, each muscle carved by drills and exercises under distant suns. His dog tags rested just out of sight beneath his collar, cool metal pressed lightly against his chest, reminding him who he was and what he'd endured. The bartender, a man in his late 50s with kind but tired eyes, slid a half-full glass of amber liquor closer to Marcus. The quiet hum of a distant radio and the low murmur of a few patrons created a gentle backdrop of sound, soothing enough that Marcus allowed himself to relax, even if just a bit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the bearing of someone who knew exactly how to handle himself if trouble ever came knocking. But tonight, trouble seemed like a distant possibility. He was not in uniform, not in any official capacity. He was simply a man trying to find a moment of calm, to let the knots in his shoulders loosen and melt away. As he sipped his drink, Marcus thought back to the people he'd known overseas, fellow soldiers who were more like family. He thought about their laughter during calm nights in foreign deserts, their courage during the hardest missions, and how different backgrounds and skin colors had never mattered when bullets were flying. He remembered the crackle of distant gunfire, the suffocating heat of midday patrols, the quiet companionship of sharing a canteen. Now, back home, all he wanted was the kind of peace he and his brothers and sisters in arms had fought so hard to protect. The door behind him creaked open, letting in a gust of cooler night air laced with the faint scent of motor oil and damp earth. Marcus didn't turn around at first. People came and went. He took another sip, savoring the slow burn. But then came the heavy clomp of boots against the floor. Not one pair, several. The muted conversation among the other patrons died down, replaced by a hush so subtle that Marcus felt it before he understood it. He raised his gaze to the tarnished mirror behind the bar, the reflection revealing what had entered. 6 men, clad in worn leather vests, jeans, and boots that seemed caked with old mud and dust. Their jackets bore crude patches and symbols Marcus didn't fully recognize, but that carried a certain threatening energy. They were bikers, and the way they carried themselves, the way they sprawled out across the small space, signaled that they expected the bar to adjust to them, not the other way around. They laughed loudly, voices rough and taunting, as if daring someone to complain. Even from across the room, Marcus could hear the edge in their tone, the undercurrent of scorn that sometimes bubbled up in places where outsiders weren't always welcome. He tried to focus on his drink, on the simple comfort of that moment. Yet he could sense something shifting. The fine hairs on the back of his neck prickled with a vague unease. He dared another look in the mirror. One of the newcomers, a large, broad-shouldered man with a blonde beard and a menacing scowl, seemed to be studying him, eyes narrowed. Another, lankier and younger, leaned in and whispered something that made the others chuckle in a way that felt mean and cold. Marcus reminded himself that he was only here to rest, to blend into the backdrop of a slow evening. But the tension in the room thickened as though someone had turned a dial, amplifying the quiet hostility. The bartender, who had been wiping a glass with a fraying towel, glanced nervously toward the bikers. A couple near the jukebox shifted uneasily, pretending not to notice anything out of the ordinary. The few remaining customers turned inward, focusing on their own drinks, as if refusing to acknowledge the dynamic at play might keep the peace. For a moment, Marcus considered finishing his drink and leaving. He had no desire to become anyone's target. He was off duty, after all, and far from any base or regiment. Yet the idea of leaving simply because some men with loud voices and hateful smirks walked in felt wrong. He'd served this country so that anyone, himself included, could move freely without intimidation. To flee now would feel like surrender, and he'd done enough fighting in uniform to know that fear should not dictate his steps. He inhaled slowly, letting the pungent odors of the tavern ground him in the present. The leather bar stool beneath him creaked as he shifted his weight. He tightened his grip on the glass, more to steady himself than out of any aggression. Tonight he was just Marcus Johnson, a man trying to live the freedom he'd helped defend. If these newcomers were going to make a scene, he would handle it with the steadiness he'd learned in countless tense situations before. Their voices grew louder as they settled into a booth not too far behind him. Bits of their conversation floated toward Marcus, crude jokes, cheap laughs, the occasional bitter word. It occurred to him that it had been a long time since he felt this kind of unease at home. Overseas, when tension rose, everyone knew the stakes. Here, the danger was quieter but no less real. He could leave, but he didn't. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking their presence alone could intimidate him. He took another sip and waited. He would see how this played out. He was a patient man, trained to read the room and sense the moment before it escalated. Outside, a car engine revved and faded into the night. Inside, the bikers' laughter slowed, replaced by a silence that was somehow louder than their jeers. Somewhere in that silence, Marcus knew a decision would be made. By them or by him. For now he would hold his ground. He would not let their presence chase him away. He focused on the moment, on controlling his breath, and prepared himself for whatever might come next. Marcus heard the words before he turned his head fully. Each syllable spiked with a quiet malice that set the hairs at the back of his neck on end. "Hey, soldier boy, you lost?" The voice belonged to the largest of the bikers, a broad man with a blonde beard that hung thick around his jaw and a pair of bloodshot eyes that seemed to cut through the dim bar light. Beneath the rough timbre of his speech lingered the faint smell of stale beer and smoke, as if he carried the scent of countless rowdy nights on his clothes. The tone was mocking, carrying that sharp note of challenge Marcus had heard so many times in his life, the kind that usually led to trouble. Marcus set his glass down slowly, careful not to spill a drop, and lifted his eyes to meet the biker's stare. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied the man's posture, the way his shoulders rolled forward as if to stake a claim in the space, the slight curl of his upper lip. This wasn't a friendly greeting, it was bait. Marcus recognized it instantly. His training and experience had taught him to distinguish between ordinary rudeness and the kind of deliberate provocation meant to corner a man into fighting. Tonight he had no desire to take that bait. He'd had his fill of violence overseas, and now that he was home, he wanted to believe he could find some measure of peace. But peace was not always easily granted, and here, in this small bar, it seemed determined to slip through his fingers. He could sense movement at the periphery of his vision, the other bikers shifting their weight, grinning behind the big man's shoulder. Their eyes flitted between Marcus and their leader, anticipation etched into the tight lines at the corners of their mouths. Marcus took note of each face, 6 in total. Some were older, their leathery skin creased and weathered. Others were younger, gazes sharper, maybe a bit hungrier. He felt the collective heat of their attention, like a circle of wolves considering a lone traveler in the woods. He knew better than to show fear. Fear was fuel to men like these, men who fed on intimidation and thrived when someone gave them a reason to escalate. He inhaled slowly, letting the warm, slightly musty air fill his lungs. The bartender, who only minutes before had seemed calm, now hovered at the edge of the tension, his hands never leaving the glass he was polishing. A young couple near the jukebox pretended to be interested in the dusty playlist, but their eyes kept flickering back to the center of the room. Marcus's mind cataloged every detail: the location of the door, the empty space just behind him, the way the men arranged themselves to block his exit. The presence of the bikers had transformed the atmosphere in a matter of moments, like storm clouds blotting out a sunny sky. "Lost," Marcus said at last, his tone measured and even. He didn't stand yet, nor did he slump in his seat. He simply turned enough to face the group, making sure the largest biker saw that he would not be cowed by that piercing stare. "I'm right where I need to be." He let the words settle, their calmness a stark contrast to the tension filling the room. In his time in the army, he'd learned that sometimes quiet composure unsettled aggressors more than any show of force. It was a skill he relied on in places far more dangerous than this, and he hoped it would serve him well now. For a moment, the biker seemed taken aback. The insult he'd hurled was supposed to provoke anger, maybe fear. Instead, he'd gotten a calm reply, neither meek nor aggressive. He tilted his head slightly, as if to see Marcus from a different angle, to decipher what kind of man this soldier boy really was. The others behind him exchanged glances. Marcus could feel them sizing him up. His build, his posture, the way he held eye contact without flinching. They'd come in expecting an easy target, someone who'd back down or lash out in anger. Marcus did neither. Instead, he chose a path they probably hadn't anticipated. The blonde-bearded man barked a short laugh, low and humorless. "You think so, huh?" he said, leaning forward. Marcus could almost feel the weight of the biker's presence, a coiled spring of aggression waiting to unspool. "Funny. I don't remember asking you to stick around." His words hung between them like a challenge, daring Marcus to push back. Behind the biker, one of his companions snickered quietly, his laughter resonating with a nervous edge. Marcus's gaze drifted momentarily to the bartender, who looked as though he might speak, then thought better of it. The young couple near the jukebox shuffled closer together, shoulders brushing as if seeking comfort. Marcus understood that many people would rather pretend not to see what was happening, fearing that involvement would draw trouble their way. He couldn't blame them. Intervening in a volatile standoff rarely ended well for bystanders. Still, the lack of open support stung a bit. He felt a flicker of disappointment at their silence, a small ache in the chest, but he refused to let that show. He didn't need them on his side to know what was right. He reminded himself that home was supposed to be different, a place where you could relax your guard. Yet here he was, confronted with hostility he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. The uniform he had worn, the sacrifices he and so many others had made, were meant to secure the kind of liberty that allowed even men like these bikers to roam free without fear. It was an irony not lost on him, that he had come here to enjoy the peace his service had helped preserve, only to find that peace being stripped away by the careless cruelty of strangers. Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had to choose his next words carefully, aware that the wrong response might push this encounter over the edge. He thought about what it meant to stand tall in the face of intimidation, about the promise he'd made to himself never to surrender his dignity out of fear. He could not let them hurt him toward violence just to prove a point. The last thing he wanted was to reduce himself to their level. Keeping his voice calm, he said, "I don't need your permission to be here." He kept his posture relaxed, but something in his eyes must have conveyed the depth of his resolve. The words came out steady, not rushed, giving no hint that the tension in the air had found any purchase in his heart. He was here. He belonged as much as anyone else. To leave now would feel like conceding ground he had every right to hold. There was a slight twitch at the corner of the biker's mouth, as if he'd expected Marcus to falter, to bark back, to curse or plead. The quiet confidence unsettled him, made him shift his weight from one foot to the other. In the silence that followed, Marcus could hear the low hum of the overhead light and the distant whir of the jukebox's idle machinery. Outside, beyond these doors, crickets would be chirping, and the night air would be soft and mild. But inside this bar, everything felt charged, poised on a knife's edge. Marcus waited. His heart was steady, his mind clear. He had no illusions about what might come next. but he would face it with the same courage and principle he carried onto battlefields far from home. He would not be moved by fear or hatred, not tonight. And in that calm resistance, he hoped to find a path forward that did not force him to abandon the hard-won tranquility he had come here to cherish. Marcus held his ground, feeling the pressure of their eyes on him, the weight of their expectations thickening the air. The blonde-bearded leader's sneer had sharpened into something colder, as if he were peering into Marcus's soul and searching for a weak point to exploit. Around him, the other bikers shifted subtly, closing the gaps in a loose, predatory semicircle. Their movements were casual but coordinated, small steps that seemed random, yet gradually hemmed him in. Boots scraped against the floorboards, sleeves rolled up to display tattoos inked in stark blacks and blues, and the overhead lights caught on their leather jackets, making the metal studs glint like teeth. "You're in the wrong bar, friend," said one of them, the lean biker with that Confederate patch stitched to his vest. He spoke the word friend with a mocking drawl, stretching its sound as though tasting something bitter. His tone was low, cutting, the sort that sent a tremor through a crowd even when the speaker barely raised his voice. Now he stood not more than 2 feet away. Marcus caught the scent of stale tobacco on his breath, and something faintly sour that he couldn't quite name. It was intimate in a way that felt intrusive, as though this man was willfully shattering the invisible walls of personal space. Marcus recognized that this was all a test, a slow, deliberate pushing of boundaries. They wanted him to flinch, to lash out, to bolt for the door, or beg for mercy. Each second that he refused to do any of those things was a small victory, but it also ramped up the tension. He had seen it countless times in training. Escalate just enough to provoke, then see how the other side reacted. If the other side blinked first, you'd won. If not, things could get much worse. He forced his shoulders to remain loose, his fists unclenched. He wouldn't show them the anger that simmered beneath his calm facade. He wanted to ask why he was in the wrong bar, what made them think they held the right to decide who belonged where. But he knew the answer was written in their eyes, their posture, the hateful symbols they wore without shame. Still, he didn't back down. Instead, he leveled his gaze at the man who'd just spoken. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said again, quietly but firmly. His voice was steady, resolute, neither pleading nor challenging, merely a statement of fact. The simple honesty in those 3 words seemed to catch the lean biker off guard for a moment, and he hesitated, as if unsure whether to mock or strike. The heavy stillness that followed was almost suffocating. Marcus could sense the eyes of the bartender at his back, the couple near the jukebox holding their breath, a lone spectator at a distant table, tensing in his seat. They were witnesses to this tableau, unwilling participants caught in the gravitational pull of a confrontation they never asked for. Outside, a passing truck's rumbling engine momentarily intruded, making the walls vibrate. Inside, not a soul moved. Marcus could feel his own heartbeat in his ears, steady and unwavering, a reminder of his training and discipline. He recalled the countless moments in faraway lands where he'd stood guard, uncertain of what threats lurked in the darkness. He remembered the mortar rounds that fell without warning, the dust and the heat, and the way his fellow soldiers, black, white, brown, stood as one. No room for division in the face of danger. That memory stiffened his spine and steadied his mind. He was no stranger to fear, but he had learned not to feed it. The silence broke as the blonde leader let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, he's not leaving," he mimicked, shaking his head as though dealing with a stubborn child. "Listen up, soldier," he said, drawing out the last word, mocking Marcus's service as if it were a stain rather than an honor. "We don't take kindly to strangers who think they can just plant themselves where they don't belong, especially when they can't even figure out when they're not wanted." His voice carried a subtle menace, and the other bikers nodded, their agreement a silent chorus of malice. The lean one with the patch smirked, revealing teeth that were a shade too yellow, and rolled his shoulders as though preparing for something more physical. Every gesture, every tick of their expressions seemed designed to wear Marcus down, to make him question his right to stand here. to exist here in this moment without apology. Marcus took in a slow breath, let it settle in his lungs, then released it just as slowly, steadying himself. He could feel a subtle trembling in the room's atmosphere, as though the tension had a pulse of its own. He was aware that a single misplaced word or sudden movement could ignite this powder keg. A part of him was tempted to just walk out, to free himself of the venomous stares and the suffocating heat of their hostility, but he pushed that thought away. Every step back he took would only strengthen their conviction that they owned this space. Every inch he yielded would confirm the lie that he was indeed in the wrong bar. He stood taller instead, meeting their eyes one by one. No anger flashed there, no hint of panic. What glimmered behind his gaze was something more profound. A sense of purpose that neither these bikers nor their prejudice could strip away. He was here, he existed, and that was enough. He would not cede his right to be present. "I said, I'm not leaving," he repeated with a slight emphasis, voice still calm. The words were like small stones dropped into still water, rippling outward into the silence. The leader's jaw tightened at this stubborn refusal to bend. Behind him, someone inhaled sharply, as though expecting blows to follow. Marcus could feel the room's collective heartbeat accelerate. The bartender shifted his weight, half hiding behind the bar's worn counter. The couple near the jukebox seemed frozen, eyes wide, perhaps praying that some cosmic mercy, would diffuse this moment before it spiraled into chaos. The man at the distant table gripped his glass tightly, knuckles white, as if he might crush it. Marcus held his ground. He had faced worse than this. He had walked through danger under foreign skies, carrying the hopes of people back home who rarely understood the cost of their freedom. If he could stand fast in a war zone, he could do so here, in this old bar, against these men who thought hatred and intimidation were marks of strength. He would not be moved by their scorn, would not run from their threats, would not shrink beneath their gaze. He settled into the silence once more, letting them feel its weight, letting them know that their words had found no soft flesh to sink into. He might have been alone, but he was not powerless. They could test him, surround him, spit their poison, but they could not shake his resolve. And so he stood, unwavering, patient, and ready, prepared for whatever might come, determined to remain who he was, no matter what they tried to make him. Marcus felt the atmosphere shift in a way that set his every nerve on edge. Though he stood in the center of a circle, it wasn't the kind of ring designed for fairness or sport. The bikers weren't calling him out to a fair fight. They were sizing him up, picking at the edges of his dignity to see if he'd unravel. He could sense their frustration mount with each of his calm refusals. They'd come in full of swagger, expecting to knock over whatever tower of pride they found in their path. Instead, they discovered a man who refused to tilt or bow. The blonde, bearded leader took another step closer, so near now that Marcus could see the faint, broken capillaries around the man's nose and the subtle trembling of lips curled into a sneer. The man's breath was sour and warm, landing unpleasantly against Marcus's cheek as he leaned in, close enough to whisper something meant only for Marcus to hear. But when he spoke, he did it loudly, making sure everyone could catch each word. His voice dripped contempt. Each syllable spat out like spoiled meat. "I know your kind," he hissed, letting that phrase dangle, ugly and loaded between them. "Think you're better than us. Think you got some right to come in here and stand tall." He paused to grin, exposing teeth that gleamed, crooked and predatory. "We'll see how tall you stand when we bring you to your knees." A hush followed, as if the entire room inhaled and forgot to exhale. Marcus forced himself not to flinch. He focused on his breathing, slow and even, recalling the techniques he'd used overseas to steady his mind when chaos pressed in. He let the man's words flow over him, refusing to let them sink their hooks into his flesh. He'd been called worse, though it never got easier. Still, what truly stung was the hatred behind the words. It was a hatred that thrived in darkness and ignorance, a smallness of spirit that shrank the world rather than embracing its vastness. He'd seen enough of the globe to know that strength came in all colors, that honor was found in the hearts of those who fought shoulder to shoulder, regardless of the distinctions that tyrants and bigots used to divide them. "Leave him be," the bartender tried, barely audible. His voice cracked, uncertain, perhaps regretting his attempt before the words had even finished leaving his mouth. The biker's head snapped in his direction, and the bartender flinched, lowering his eyes and retreating a half step, as though he'd leaned too close to a campfire and singed his eyebrows. He'd offered no real help, just a hollow suggestion that vanished into the silence. Marcus understood the man's fear. He bore him no ill will, but it reminded him of the complexities of home, how many would stand aside and watch, unwilling to risk their own comfort for someone else's dignity. The lean biker with the Confederate patch snorted a laugh, pulling attention back to Marcus. "We got ourselves a tough one," he remarked to his brethren, as if narrating a spectacle for an invisible crowd. "A real hero." His eyes gleamed with a brittle kind of mockery, testing Marcus's composure. Marcus thought of the medals and commendations tucked away in a drawer back home, silent testimonies to sacrifice and courage in lands far from here. He didn't need to brag or shout his story. He carried it quietly, like the weight of his dog tags that lay hidden beneath his shirt. The circle tightened again. A boot scuffed the floor. A sleeve brushed Marcus's shoulder. These were small provocations, each one a step toward forcing Marcus's hand. He could feel their impatience growing, as if they were thinking, "Come on, show fear, lash out, give us a reason." All the while he kept breathing steadily, reminding himself that this was just another battlefield, different terrain, different kind of enemy, but the same principle. Keep your head, never let them see the chaos in your heart. He swallowed, meeting the blonde leader's gaze without blinking. There was a righteousness inside Marcus that burned brighter than the bile these men spewed. He had faced men with guns who wanted him dead, who might have ended his life at any moment if he made the wrong move. Compared to that, this confrontation, while disturbing and offensive, felt like a feeble challenge, yet he could not dismiss it. Hate was a cancer that spread if left unchecked. And while he stood in this bar, in this exact moment, he was determined that it would not find easy purchase here. The leader's voice cut through the silence again. "You know what you are?" he asked, tone dropping low and conspiratorial, as though imparting a secret meant to wound. "You're just another." He let the slur come out, vile and heavy, staining the air like spilled oil on fresh water. A ripple of discomfort passed through the onlookers. The young couple by the jukebox froze, eyes wide and shining with uncertainty. The solitary man at the distant table stiffened, his breath catching. Even the bartender, who had tried to stay neutral, closed his eyes and swallowed hard. Words like that carried a dreadful history, the weight of centuries of cruelty and injustice. For a fraction of a second, the entire world seemed to narrow to Marcus, the speaker, and that word that still hung there, hissing and venomous. Marcus felt a flicker of rage surge up from deep inside him, a spark he had to smother quickly. He reminded himself that he was not a servant to their hatred. He would not allow their cruelty to command his reactions. They wanted him to lash out, to lose control, to confirm their twisted narrative. He would not oblige. He took a slow breath. Images flashed through his mind, comrades in arms who never saw color or creed when it came to protecting one another. The flags folded neatly over caskets of those who died so that freedom might endure. The dreams he carried back home, hoping to find a country that honored the sacrifices he and countless others had made. He could not let the ugliness of a few men define this moment. He had to believe there was something better, some deeper truth that would prevail. "I've heard worse," he said quietly, voice steady, each syllable precise. "I've seen more than you could imagine." He didn't speak of details. He didn't need to. Let them wonder what he meant. Let them chew on the fact that he remained calm, dignified, unbroken. He was not their equal in hatred. He would not meet them on that battlefield. He held himself apart, a quiet pillar of resolve that their insults washed over like a filthy tide receding from a shore of solid rock. The leader's face twitched with anger. He wanted a reaction. He needed Marcus to flinch or lash out, something that would justify the violence simmering beneath his skin. Instead, Marcus stood firm, letting the weight of the slur settle in the dust. He knew words could wound, but he also knew they only held power if he let them. He would acknowledge the hatred without succumbing to it, recognize the cruelty, but refuse to become its mirror. The blond man's knuckles cracked as he flexed his hands, and the other bikers stirred, restless and uncertain. This was not going as they'd planned. Marcus could sense their confusion, their frustration that he hadn't crumbled. In that subtle shift, he took comfort. Even as their malice lingered, they had failed to break him. They were left standing in a circle of tension they had created, unsure how to proceed now that he refused to meet hate with hate. Beyond them, the bar seemed to hold its breath. Marcus braced himself, knowing this was far from over. The men around him still had options. They might push harder, escalate from words to fists. He did not relish that possibility, but he would not cede his ground. They had tested him with silence, with intimidation, with vile insults. Through it all, he remained as he was, a man who had faced the worst parts of humanity and survived, who knew how to stand firm without losing himself to the darkness they offered. And so he waited, calm and steady, for whatever came next. Marcus could feel the temperature in the room drop, as the blonde leader's voice peeled through the silence like a jagged blade. Each new insult spilled into the hushed air, daring Marcus to snap, to give in and give them the reaction they craved. Instead, he remained still, arms loose at his sides, refusing to raise his voice, refusing to stoop to their level. He'd endured tension on distant battlefields, 1,000 quiet moments when life or death hinged on keeping one's cool. And this was no different. The hatefulness here, though more personal and intimate, was just another test of resolve. "I know what you're thinking," the blonde leader growled, leaning in until his shoulder nearly brushed Marcus's chest. The sour smell of old whiskey and tobacco came off the man in waves. "You're thinking you're so disciplined, so tough, some kind of hero who doesn't have to answer to us." He smiled in a way that sent a cold ripple through the watchers. "Well, let me tell you something, soldier. In here, you don't stand for nothing. You're just meat." He spat the last word with such vehemence that a tiny fleck of saliva struck Marcus's shirt. Marcus's stomach tightened, but he let the insult pass. He reminded himself why he'd come home, to find peace, to reconnect with the ideals he'd fought for, to believe that all the sacrifice meant something. Still, he was painfully aware that these bikers had chosen to attack him precisely because he represented something they detested. Was it the color of his skin that fueled their cruelty, or the uniform he'd once worn, or simply the fact that he did not give them the deference they believed they deserved? Probably all of it. It didn't matter. Marcus knew giving in to anger now would prove nothing, except that their hatred could taint him. Behind him, a throat cleared. The bartender dared another tiny attempt. "Come on now," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Let's not." But he got no further. One of the other bikers, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, whirled and jabbed a finger in the bartender's direction. Eyes narrowed into slits. The bartender held up both hands, an apologetic gesture, and retreated behind the counter, his courage spent. The young couple by the jukebox exchanged frightened glances, stepping farther back into the shadows as if hoping to disappear. The lone patron at the far table half rose, looked around as if searching for an ally, then sank back down with a muttered curse, clearly unwilling to put himself in harm's way. Marcus noted these small movements without turning his head. He understood their fear. Civilians weren't trained for these moments. They didn't know how to handle a confrontation simmering at this temperature. He wished someone would step forward, if only to show that these bikers did not own the night, that ordinary people could still stand against hatred. But he couldn't fault them for their silence. It was easy to talk about courage until the fists and curses loomed inches from your face. The leader took a step back, glancing at his friends as if to say, "See what I'm dealing with?" He wanted their support, their cheers, a chorus of agreement to fuel his vile performance. Emboldened by the silence of the bar's witnesses, he curled his lip in a sneer and turned his full attention back to Marcus. "Takes a lot of nerve coming in here acting like you belong," he said. "But you don't. Men like us built this place. Men like you just think you can waltz in and take what's ours." Marcus inhaled, slow and steady, his eyes unwavering. He could have argued the point, could have reminded them that this land belonged to everyone who called themselves Americans, that he had as much right to stand here as anyone else. He could have listed the places he'd served, the dangers he'd faced, to protect the freedoms that let these men roam free. But to what end? Words wouldn't pierce the armor of their arrogance. He sensed that, to them, dialogue was just a distraction. They wanted to force him to break, to beg, or to fight. Staying calm denied them that satisfaction. "I serve so people like you could stand where you want," Marcus finally said, his voice low but firm. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The truth was simple, unadorned, and heavy with meaning. "I've earned my place in this country. I don't need your permission to be here." He spoke plainly, letting each word settle. He knew these men would not be moved by reason or principle, but speaking his truth was not for their benefit alone. It was also for anyone listening, anyone wondering if he would cave under pressure. The leader's eyes flickered, momentarily uncertain. He likely hadn't expected that. He had aimed to humiliate, to unnerve, to frighten her, and now faced a man who stood rooted like an oak tree, refusing to sway. The tension in the room reached a brittle peak, and Marcus could almost feel it crackling in the air, dancing along the edges of every gaze. The lean biker with the Confederate patch sidled closer, trying a different angle. "You're not special," he hissed, voice dripping contempt. "You think you're some kind of saint?" He reached out as if to poke Marcus's chest, to punctuate his insult with the tip of his finger, but stopped at the last instant, perhaps wary that even a man this calm had a limit. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had faced this kind of hatred before, though seldom so openly. He knew the patterns, recognized the poison in their words. Each taunt was designed to dehumanize, to reduce him to something less than a man deserving respect. He would not reward their efforts. Without raising his voice, without changing his stance, he said, "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not running from it either." His gaze moved from the lean biker to the leader and back again, ensuring none of them felt ignored. "If you're waiting for me to back down, you're in for a long night." There it was again, the calm, immovable presence that he projected. Marcus saw their frustration deepen. The big blonde leader's nostrils flared, and he exhaled sharply, as though trying to blow away a particularly stubborn cloud of smoke. The circle of bikers shuffled their positions, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't going as planned. They had wanted to see him squirm, and instead, he'd filled the quiet spaces with dignity and restraint. For the first time since they arrived, Marcus sensed uncertainty creeping into their ranks. The casual arrogance that had accompanied their entrance began to falter. He recognized that this didn't mean they would give up, but perhaps they realized brute intimidation wasn't working. That was something, at least. And so, as the bar remained hushed and tense, Marcus stood firm, heart steady, mind focused. He didn't know if his resolve would prevent violence, but he knew he had not let them drag him down. In the stifling air of that small tavern, he held tight to the values that guided him, refusing to surrender the high ground. If they wanted him broken or shaken, they would have to try a lot harder. When he was done giving in to hatred on foreign soil, he'd confronted enemies with weapons. Here, at home, he confronted them with calm conviction. In both places, he refused to abandon his own humanity. Marcus sensed the powder keg atmosphere deepening around him, a silent countdown ticking in the men's narrowed eyes and tightened jaws. The tension had stretched so taut that the slightest jolt would snap it. He noticed small details that most would miss, the way one biker cracked his knuckles slowly, deliberately, as if picturing them sinking into flesh. The subtle shift of another's stance, putting weight on the balls of his feet, ready for a sudden lunge. They were testing him, cornering him like predators circling a wounded animal. Only he wasn't wounded, and he refused to be prey. The bartender hovered a few steps away, face etched with worry. His eyes darted from Marcus to the gang of men, as if trying to find some magical word that would end all this. But he knew, as Marcus did, that words had already failed. The young couple near the jukebox stood close, arms wrapped around one another. The fear in their eyes was no longer subtle. It was stark, raw, and mirrored the helplessness of everyone else who witnessed this unfolding standoff. Outside, a distant motorcycle engine revved and faded into the night. A hollow reminder that there were more like these bikers out there, somewhere, and that the world was not always a place of safety and reason. The blonde leader stepped forward again. He didn't speak. Instead, he let his knuckles graze Marcus's shoulder, slightly but deliberately, just enough to signal what he was capable of. The touch was invasive, meant to provoke. Marcus held his breath, forcing himself not to recoil. Reacting on their terms would invite the violence they so obviously hungered for. He thought of all the reasons to stay calm, the training etched into muscle and bone, the friends he'd lost in combat, the ideals he'd served. He knew that brute force was not the answer here. These men wanted a fight, wanted to assert their twisted brand of superiority. If he gave it to them, they would bask in it like vultures over fresh carrion. Marcus shifted slightly. Just enough to break the contact, yet not enough to seem like he was retreating. He refused to be cornered, but also refused to strike the first blow. He met the leader's eyes, letting him see the quiet fire that still burned in his soul, an unyielding certainty that no matter how much they spat their venom, they could not change who he was or what he'd done for this country. The leader's gaze flickered, as though frustrated by his inability to rattle this man. The lean biker with the Confederate patch stepped closer, sensing the leader's frustration and trying a new angle. "What's the matter?" he taunted, voice low, almost intimate. "Cat got your tongue?" He smirked, leaning in as if to whisper some secret. Marcus held his ground. He felt the man's hot, sour breath, saw the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Here was a man who believed in intimidation as currency, who expected Marcus to cower when Marcus didn't. The lean biker's smirk faltered. He let out a sharp breath, irritated at the unshakable calm before him. Around them, the other bikers shuffled restlessly, muttering under their breaths. This was supposed to have been easy. Find a target, heap insults, make him break. Instead, they were confronted with someone who refused to yield or rage, who stood as if he belonged as much as they did. They had no script for this. Their anger felt like old fuel looking for a spark. But Marcus refused to provide one. When the blonde leader finally spoke again, his voice was deeper, and behind it Marcus could hear the unmistakable note of anger, tensed like a spring. "This ain't a place for you," he said. "You think you can come here, flash those soldier eyes, and we'll bow down? You don't belong." He leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper that still managed to carry across the silence of the bar. "Get out, or we'll make you leave." Marcus inhaled through his nose, steady and long, letting the man's words wash over him. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the quiet settle like dust in the corners. He felt the eyes of the bartender, the couple, and the lone patron on his back, heavy with anticipation. When he finally spoke, he aimed his words not just at the leader, but at everyone in the room, even those who remained silent. "I've stood my ground in places far worse than this," he said calmly. "I'm not leaving unless I choose to." The leader bared his teeth, as if snarling at prey that refused to run. A low chuckle rose from one of the bikers in the back, but it lacked confidence. They were being challenged in a way they did not expect. Hatred was supposed to break a man down, reduce him to fear or fury, and yet here was someone using their malice like a mirror, reflecting it back with silent condemnation. They were showing the entire bar what ugly things they carried inside. The lean biker tried a new tack, waving a hand dramatically around the dusty room. "Look around. Nobody's lifting a finger for you," he said. "Not the bartender, not those folks huddled in the corner. You're all alone here, soldier boy." He meant it as a final cruelty, a reminder of Marcus's isolation. But Marcus already knew he was alone. He'd been alone in the quiet moments of war, isolated in hostile lands. Survival had taught him self-reliance. He'd learned that moral strength didn't always come with cheering crowds or friendly backs to guard. Sometimes you stood by yourself. because standing was all you had left. His gaze swept the room, acknowledging the fear in every pair of eyes that dared meet his. He bore them no ill will. They were simply not made of the same steel, nor had they been tested in the same fires. He understood their silence, even as it hurt to know that nobody here would speak for him. No matter. He knew who he was and why he stood his ground. He would not abandon his convictions, simply because he stood alone. If anything, their silence only sharpened his resolve. "Then I guess I stand alone," Marcus said, quietly. The words were neither boastful nor self-pitying. They were simply true. The blonde leader's brow furrowed at this calm acceptance. He wanted Marcus to feel crushed by isolation, but instead, he found a man who wore solitude like armor. Beneath the heat and tension, an uneasy stillness settled in. Marcus remained unwavering, daring them to decide, escalate or walk away. He would not yield his integrity. He would not lash out in anger. He would simply be what he had always been, a man who fought for something larger than himself, who defended the right of all to exist freely, even those who now tested him with hateful eyes and clenched fists. The night stretched long and uncertain. Marcus could feel the weight of this standoff press against every breath, every beat of his heart. But he would not step back. He could not. If he surrendered now, he surrendered the very principles that had brought him here. Principles he had carried home, hoping to find the justice he and his brothers and sisters in arms had fought to protect. Marcus stood firm, his feet planted as though they had roots in the old hardwood floor. The thick silence pressed on him like humid air before a storm, and he could feel every eye in the bar waiting to see how he would respond. A single overhead bulb hummed, its warm light catching the nervous sweat on the biker's brows. The dust motes suspended in the air, and the tension etched into every tight-lipped expression. In that hush, Marcus felt a truth crystallize. These men had come expecting to strip him of his dignity, to force him into a corner where he'd lash out, crumble, or flee. Instead, he'd answered their threats with calm resolve, and each passing second chipped away at their confidence. The blonde leader flicked his gaze over his shoulder at his companions, searching for a spark of inspiration, a next move. He wasn't just dealing with a lone man anymore. He was dealing with the idea that this soldier, this quiet pillar, might not break no matter what they tried. That unsettled him. He tugged at his vest as if the leather had grown too tight. A low growl rumbled in his throat, frustration leaking through his thinning mask of control. Marcus saw all this in the way the leader's shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched. Without breaking eye contact, Marcus reached up and hooked a finger beneath his shirt collar. The move was slow, deliberate, and not a single person in the room missed it. He pulled something from beneath his shirt and let it fall into the open air. A pair of dog tags, the dull metal catching the light, swinging gently like a pendulum. The quiet jangle was soft, but in the silence, it rang with meaning. "I served," Marcus said, voice steady as stone. He didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. His words seemed to carry on their own current. "I served so that everyone, no matter who they are, can stand in a place like this without fear." The metal tags glinted once as he let them settle against his chest. "I served with men and women who didn't care about my skin color. They cared about whether I had their back when it counted." A flicker of discomfort passed through the gathered bikers. The blonde leader's nostrils flared, and he looked suddenly uncertain, as if someone had yanked the script from his hand. He had expected defiance, maybe some angry retort he could twist into an excuse to swing a fist. Instead, he got a quiet declaration of service and sacrifice. The dog tags were proof of something larger than this bar, something these men couldn't easily belittle. The lean biker with the Confederate patch squinted at those tags, as if staring might reveal a weakness. "You think that makes you special?" he spat, but his voice lacked the edge it had before. There was a faint tremor in his words, a shaky uncertainty. "You think we owe you something?" Marcus shook his head, a gentle negative that calmed the air around him. "I'm not asking you to owe me anything," he said. His voice carried no judgment, just a calm statement of fact. "I'm telling you that I fought for your right to be here too. That's what we were doing over there, all of us, black, white, and everything in between." A hush followed, and this time it felt different. Before, the silence had been charged with violence, vibrating like a taut wire ready to snap. Now there was a weight to it that seemed to draw them all deeper into their own thoughts. Marcus had taken their hatred and placed it in a broader context, reminding them that while they tested him, he had already been tested in ways they would never understand. The bartender, still standing behind the counter, leaned forward a fraction of an inch. A look of something like respect tugged at his weary features. The young couple by the jukebox glanced at each other, their rigid fear softening into something else. Surprise. Admiration. Relief. Even the lone patron at the back table seemed to straighten, as if seeing Marcus for the first time not as a lone victim, but as a man with a history, a purpose, and a quiet strength that was reshaping the narrative unfolding before them. The blonde leader made a noise low in his throat, part scoff and part growl. He looked as though he wanted to strike Marcus, but some invisible chain held him back. To lash out now would be to attack the very idea of someone who had bled and sweated for the freedoms these men took for granted. "We didn't ask for that," he finally said, voice hoarse. It sounded weak. He must have sensed that too, because he cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "We didn't ask you to fight for us." Marcus's gaze never wavered. "You didn't have to," he replied simply. "We did it anyway, for all Americans. I learned a lot over there. Discipline, courage, the value of standing up for what's right. I'm not standing here looking for a fight. I'm standing here because I won't be bullied into leaving. I've already faced worse things than your threats. I faced them so we could all have a place in this country." His words landed heavy in the silence. For a moment, the bikers looked at each other, their earlier bravado sagging under the weight of Marcus's quiet truth. They were men who prided themselves on their toughness, but here stood a man who had proven his toughness in a crucible they'd never know, and who carried it with a grace they didn't understand. The blonde leader's tongue darted across his bottom lip. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find something that could puncture Marcus's dignity. The lean biker's smirk had dissolved into a clenched jaw. Another biker shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking away as if he'd suddenly become interested in a stain on the floor. And in that moment, a subtle shift occurred in the bar's atmosphere. The tension, while still present, had begun to cool. Hatred, confronted by calm integrity, faltered. Marcus didn't gloat or sneer. He didn't need to. He just let the truth of who he was and what he'd done settle into the cracks of their bravado. "I'm not leaving," Marcus reiterated softly. "But I'm not here to shame you either. I'm just here, like anyone else, to have a drink, to be free, to stand on my own 2 feet, without fear." He let that sink in. "That's what I fought for." The bikers stood there, caught off guard, their next move uncertain. The room's silence changed flavor once more, from a silence of fear and threat to a silence where everyone reconsidered what they believed and why. And Marcus, steady and unwavering, reminded them all that some battles are fought without raising a fist, that real strength isn't measured by how easily one can dominate or degrade another, but by the dignity one chooses to maintain in the face of hatred. Marcus felt the atmosphere in the bar teetering on the brink of eruption. The silent witnesses and patrons who had once been lost in their own worlds now found themselves involuntarily drawn into the unfolding drama. The tension was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. But Marcus remained an island of calm amidst the brewing storm. He glanced around the room, taking in the varied expressions of fear, uncertainty, and in some corners, a flicker of admiration. The young couple by the jukebox held each other tighter. The lone patron at the back table straightened in his seat, and even the bartender seemed to inch forward slightly, as if reassessing his stance. It was in this collective uncertainty that Marcus saw an opportunity, not just for himself, but for everyone present. Taking a deep breath, he decided to act, not out of aggression, but out of a desire to reclaim the peace he had sought. Slowly he stood up from his stool, his movements deliberate and measured. The room watched, a collective gaze fixed upon him, anticipating the next move. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up so that everyone could see the screen. It wasn't just any phone, it displayed a video call in progress, the image of his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, visible and authoritative. "Captain Reynolds," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "I'm at Greenfield Tavern, and there's a situation here that needs addressing." The mention of his captain's name sent a ripple through the bar. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado wavering as the weight of authority began to dawn on them. Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving the leaders. "I don't want any trouble, but I won't stand by while hatred is spread in this place. Respect is something we all deserve." Behind him, the phone's screen flickered briefly, Captain Reynolds nodding solemnly. "Marcus, if you're in danger, don't hesitate to call for backup," the captain advised, his voice a blend of concern and pride. "Stay safe." The leader's posture shifted instantly, the earlier aggression draining away as the realization of potential consequences set in. He took a step back, muttering under his breath, his bravado now a fragile facade. The other bikers hesitated, uncertainty replacing their earlier certainty. Marcus could feel their resolve weakening, the influence of authority making them reconsider their actions. Seeing their hesitation, Marcus seized the moment to appeal to their humanity. "We're all here to enjoy a drink, to unwind," he said, his tone softening. "There's no need for this kind of hostility. Let's all just go our separate ways and enjoy our evenings." The leader wiped his forehead, the tension easing from his shoulders. He looked around at his crew, the thin veil of unity among them cracking. "You think you can just call in your buddies and make us leave?" he challenged, but his voice lacked its former edge. Marcus nodded, meeting his gaze without fear. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking for mutual respect. We all have a right to be here." The bartender, sensing the shift, began to relax, slowly returning to his duties with a tentative hope. The young couple by the jukebox exhaled deeply, their bodies releasing the tension they had been holding. Even the lone patron at the back table seemed to regain his composure, his earlier fear subsiding into cautious optimism. The leader glanced at his men, their expressions mirroring his own internal conflict. One by one, they began to nod, the collective decision to de-escalate taking root. The leader took a final deep breath, his posture softening. "Fine," he said, his voice begrudging, "but this doesn't mean we like it." With that, the group turned and made their way towards the exit, their earlier aggression now tempered by the presence of authority and Marcus's unwavering calm. As they left, the room exhaled collectively, the oppressive tension dissipating into the night air. Marcus sank back into his stool, the immediate threat having passed but the impact of his actions lingering in the room. He felt a surge of relief, tempered by the knowledge that such moments were rare and precious. The bystanders, who had been on the edge of witnessing a potential confrontation, now looked at him with a newfound respect. They saw not just a man who had stood his ground, but someone who had embodied the very principles he had fought for in service. The bartender approached him, a hesitant smile breaking through his initial fear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure what would happen." Marcus nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "Sometimes all it takes is a little courage and respect." The young woman by the jukebox gave him a grateful nod, her earlier fear replaced by admiration. "You did the right thing," she said softly. The lone patron at the back table gave a small thumbs up, a silent gesture of approval. Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, the shared humanity in that moment reaffirming his belief in justice and dignity. As he took another sip of his drink, the sounds of the bar returned to their usual hum, the shadows reclaiming their corners. The night had been a test, and Marcus had passed with grace and strength. He knew that the battle against hatred and bigotry was far from over, but moments like these were steps toward a more understanding and respectful world. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each patron, feeling a sense of connection and purpose. He had come seeking peace, and in standing up for himself, he had also inspired a sense of solidarity among those who had witnessed his courage. It was a quiet victory, but one that resonated deeply within him. As the evening wore on, Marcus felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of his experiences, the scars of battle, and the burden of service were still there, but in this small bar, amidst ordinary people, he had found a moment of redemption, a reminder that true strength lay not in the ability to fight, but in the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And as he finally decided to leave, stepping out into the cool night air, he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who had watched him stand tall against hate. It was a move that had stunned them all, but more importantly, it had reaffirmed the values he held dear. Marcus walked away with his head held high, a soldier of peace, in a world that desperately needed it. Marcus felt the immediate relief of the biker's departure settle over the bar like a gentle rain after a fierce storm. The air, once thick with hostility, now buzzed with a subtle energy of change. Patrons began to stir, conversations tentatively resuming, though eyes lingered on Marcus with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. The bartender gave him a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of his courage and composure. But Marcus knew that the confrontation, though resolved, was merely a symptom of a deeper malaise that plagued their community. He couldn't ignore the discomfort etched into the faces of the bystanders, the unease that hinted at underlying tensions simmering beneath the surface of everyday interactions. As he sat back down, the weight of what had transpired pressed upon him, mingling with a sense of responsibility that felt both foreign and familiar. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, reflecting on the path that had led him here. His service had taught him the value of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Yet, in this small bar, the battlefield was different. No physical combat, just a clash of ideologies and prejudices. Marcus realized that his next move had to transcend mere confrontation. It needed to foster understanding and bridge the divides that fueled such hatred. Looking around, Marcus noticed the subtle shifts in the room. The young woman by the jukebox, who had initially been paralyzed by fear, now approached him with a tentative smile. "You know," she began, her voice soft but sincere, "I've seen a lot of things, but witnessing someone stand up like that, it's inspiring. Thank you." Marcus offered a genuine smile in return. "Thank you. Sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference." Encouraged by her words, he felt a surge of determination. If he could inspire even one person to challenge their own prejudices, it was a step toward the change he wanted to see. But he needed more. A way to ensure that the moment wasn't just a fleeting instance of bravery, but a catalyst for broader transformation. As he pondered, an idea began to take shape. He remembered the conversations he had with fellow soldiers about the importance of community and unity. They had often discussed how their shared experiences could build bridges across diverse backgrounds, fostering mutual respect and understanding. Perhaps he could bring that same spirit to his hometown. "I think it would be great to have some kind of community event," Marcus suggested, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled after the confrontation. "Something that brings people together, celebrates our differences, and highlights the things we have in common." The bartender raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Like what?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes alight with purpose. "A forum, or a series of discussions where people can share their stories, their experiences. Maybe even some workshops on conflict resolution and understanding. We could invite veterans, community leaders, and anyone willing to participate. It could help address some of the underlying issues that lead to situations like tonight." The young woman by the jukebox nodded enthusiastically. "That's a wonderful idea. I'd love to help organize something like that. It could really make a difference." The lone patron at the back table, who had previously watched in silent fascination, chimed in. "Count me in. I've seen enough division around here. Maybe it's time we tried to bridge some gaps." Encouraged by the support, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just an isolated incident. It was an opportunity to effect meaningful change. He realized that his role wasn't limited to protecting others on the battlefield. He could also be a guardian of peace and understanding within his own community. As the evening progressed, conversations flowed more freely. People shared their thoughts and ideas, the earlier tension giving way to a collective desire for improvement. Marcus facilitated discussions, drawing upon his leadership skills honed in the military to guide the dialogue towards constructive outcomes. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and the strength that comes from unity. By the time the bar began to empty, a plan had begun to take shape. Marcus had exchanged contact information with several key individuals, including the bartender, the young woman who had inspired him, and the lone patron who had stepped forward. They discussed potential venues, topics for discussion, and ways to reach out to the wider community. The initial seed of an idea had blossomed into a tangible initiative aimed at healing and reconciliation. As he prepared to leave, Marcus felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The night had started with fear and confrontation, but it had evolved into a beacon of hope. He understood that the path to justice and redemption wasn't always paved with grand gestures or dramatic victories. Sometimes, it began with a single person's quiet strength and the willingness to inspire others. Stepping out into the cool night air, Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the fresh scent of pine and earth. The stars twinkled above, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the potential for change within it. He looked back at the bar, now bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights, and felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had found a way to channel his experiences and his resilience into something that could benefit his community, reaffirming his belief in the power of individual action to inspire collective transformation. As he walked down the quiet street, Marcus reflected on the journey ahead. Organizing the community forum would require dedication, patience, and unwavering commitment, but he was ready. He had faced adversity before and emerged stronger each time. Now, armed with the support of newfound allies and the lessons learned from his service, he was prepared to take on this new challenge. In that moment, Marcus realized that his true battle wasn't against enemies with badges or blades, but against the ingrained prejudices and fears that divided people. By standing his ground that night, he had ignited a spark, a movement toward understanding and unity that, with time and effort, could transform his hometown into a place where everyone felt valued and respected. His next move, rooted in compassion and courage, had indeed stunned everyone watching, not with force or confrontation, but with the quiet determination to make a difference. And as he continued his walk home, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that his actions had planted the seeds for a brighter, more inclusive future. Marcus felt a surge of purpose as he left the bar that night, the cool air brushing against his face like a refreshing balm after the heated confrontation. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. His mind replayed the conversations he had just had, the ideas that had taken root in that small tavern. Organizing a community event wasn't just a way to address the immediate tension. It was a step toward healing the deeper wounds that festered beneath the surface of his hometown. The next morning, Marcus woke with a clear sense of determination. He knew that turning his idea into reality would require more than just good intentions. It would demand organization, outreach, and resilience. After a quick breakfast, he reached out to the contacts he had made the previous night. His phone buzzed with messages and calls, each one a testament to the impact of his actions. First on his list was Emma, the young woman by the jukebox who had expressed a keen interest in helping. Marcus found her at the local library, shelving books with the same tentative smile she had offered him before. "Emma," he greeted her warmly, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming." She shook his hand firmly, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Of course, Marcus. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I want to do whatever I can to help." They sat down at a nearby table, pulling out notebooks and pens. I was thinking we could start with a town hall meeting, Marcus suggested. Something open where people can share their experiences and listen to each other. Maybe even invite some local leaders and veterans to speak. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a great idea. I can help with the logistics, finding a venue, promoting the event. I know a few people who would be interested in participating. As they mapped out the details, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But it was a weight he welcomed. He reached out to the bartender next, finding him at the same bar where everything had begun. The man, whose name was Joe, greeted him with a nod of respect. "You ready to make some changes, Marcus?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied, sharing the plans they had discussed with Emma. Joe listened intently, his usual reservations replaced by a newfound sense of hope. "I can provide space here after hours if needed, and I'll help spread the word among the regulars." With Joe on board, Marcus turned his attention to the lone patron at the back table, a man named Tom who had given a thumbs up that night. Tom was a retired teacher, known for his quiet demeanor and thoughtful nature. Marcus found him at the local community center, engaged in a game of chess with a young boy. "Tom," Marcus greeted him, taking a seat opposite. "Thanks for agreeing to help." Tom looked up, a smile breaking through his usually reserved expression. "I've been thinking about it, Marcus. We need something like this more than ever. I can help with the educational materials and maybe organize some workshops on conflict resolution." "Perfect," Marcus said, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Your experience in education will be invaluable." With Emma, Joe, and Tom on board, Marcus felt a solid foundation forming beneath him. They began to coordinate their efforts, each bringing their unique strengths to the table. Emma handled the promotional aspects, designing flyers and utilizing social media to reach a broader audience. Joe offered the bar as a potential venue, providing a familiar and neutral space where people felt comfortable gathering. Tom took charge of organizing workshops and discussion panels, drawing on his background to create meaningful and engaging content. As the weeks progressed, the community began to take notice. Conversations that had once been fraught with tension now found new avenues of understanding. Marcus found himself meeting with diverse groups, from local business owners to young students, each bringing their own perspectives and stories. He listened more than he spoke, understanding that the true power of this initiative lay in giving others the space to express themselves. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected invitation from Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, his former commanding officer. She had heard about his efforts and wanted to offer support. "Marcus," her message began, "I'm proud of what you're doing. If there's anything I can do to help, don't hesitate to reach out." He felt a swell of pride and gratitude. Reconnecting with Sarah meant tapping into a network of support that extended beyond his immediate community. They arranged a meeting at a local coffee shop, where Sarah shared resources and offered guidance on organizing the town hall. Her presence was a reminder of the brotherhood he had left behind and the values that continued to guide him. As the day of the town hall approached, the excitement and nervousness in the air were palpable. Emma's promotional efforts had paid off, with a steady stream of RSVPs filling the attendee list. Posters adorned the walls of the bar and the community center, each one a testament to the growing momentum behind Marcus's initiative. The evening of the event arrived, and Marcus stood at the entrance of the community center, watching as people began to trickle in. Faces that had once held suspicion and resentment now bore expressions of curiosity and hope. The room was arranged to facilitate open dialogue, with chairs facing a central stage where speakers would present their stories. Emma and Tom worked diligently alongside him, ensuring that every detail was in place. Joe provided refreshments, offering drinks and snacks to keep the atmosphere welcoming and relaxed. As the last of the attendees took their seats, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of weeks of effort settle over him. The event began with a welcome speech from Tom, who spoke about the importance of community and the power of shared experiences. Following him, a few local veterans shared their stories, highlighting the bonds forged in service and the challenges of returning to civilian life. Their narratives echoed Marcus's own experiences, creating a bridge of understanding between military and civilian communities. Then it was Marcus's turn. Standing before the room, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He glanced around, meeting the eyes of those who had once been silent bystanders, but now looked to him for leadership. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "When I walked into that bar the other night, I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was standing up for all of us, to challenge hatred and to foster respect. Tonight, we take that step together, to listen, to understand, and to build a community where everyone feels valued." His words resonated deeply, sparking a series of heartfelt conversations that flowed throughout the evening. People shared their fears, their hopes, and their visions for a more inclusive community. The air was filled with a sense of unity and possibility, a stark contrast to the hostility that had marked Marcus's initial encounter with the bikers. As the event drew to a close, Marcus felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had not only diffused a moment of tension, but had also planted the seeds for lasting change. The discussions had opened doors to empathy and understanding, proving that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, dialogue and compassion could pave the way for reconciliation. Walking home under the starry night, Marcus reflected on the journey so far. From a solitary drink in a quiet bar to organizing a community event that had touched so many lives, he had discovered a new mission, one that complemented his service and honored the sacrifices he had made. He knew that challenges lay ahead, but the support and solidarity he had witnessed filled him with hope. As he reached his doorstep, Marcus looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly above. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that his actions had made a difference. The road to redemption and unity was long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time, guided by the principles of justice, personal growth, and the unwavering belief in the power of redemption. The day of the community forum dawned clear and bright, the sun casting a warm glow over the quiet streets of Greenfield. Marcus woke early, the excitement and nerves intertwining within him like the threads of a well-woven fabric. Today was the culmination of weeks of planning, of reaching out and building bridges, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on his shoulders. After a simple breakfast, he donned his civilian clothes, jeans and a plain shirt, and made his way to the community center, where the event was to be held. The community center was a modest building, its walls adorned with local art and photographs capturing moments of everyday life. Inside, the space had been transformed into a welcoming venue. Rows of chairs faced a central stage, and tables lined the sides, adorned with informational brochures and refreshments. Emma, Joe, and Tom were already there, bustling about to ensure everything was in order. Emma coordinated the registration desk, greeting attendees with a friendly smile, while Joe set up the refreshment tables, arranging drinks and snacks with practiced efficiency. Tom adjusted the microphones and tested the sound system, his calm demeanor a reassuring presence amidst the controlled chaos. As the first guests began to arrive, Marcus greeted them personally, shaking hands and exchanging brief conversations. The diversity of the attendees was striking. Veterans in uniform, young students, local business owners, and long-time residents, each bringing their own stories and perspectives. The atmosphere buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and cautious optimism, the air thick with the potential for meaningful dialogue. At precisely 7 o'clock, Tom stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding, yet approachable. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice steady and warm. "Thank you for joining us tonight. This forum is about more than just talking. It's about listening, understanding, and finding common ground. We're here to share our experiences, our challenges, and our hopes for a more united community." He introduced the first speaker, a local high school teacher named Linda, who shared her experiences working with students from diverse backgrounds. Her heartfelt narrative highlighted both the struggles and the triumphs of fostering an inclusive environment in education. The audience listened intently, nodding in agreement and some wiping away tears as Linda spoke of her efforts to bridge gaps and promote understanding among her students. Next was James, a retired firefighter and veteran, who recounted his service alongside men and women of all races and creeds. "In the firehouse, we were a family," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "When a fire broke out, it didn't matter where you came from or what you believed in. We worked together, risking our lives to save others. That's the kind of unity we need here in our community." As the evening progressed, more speakers took the stage, each contributing their unique perspectives. Stories of overcoming prejudice, building alliances, and the importance of empathy filled the room, weaving a tapestry of shared human experience. The discussions flowed seamlessly, transitioning from personal anecdotes to broader societal issues, each topic handled with respect and a genuine desire for resolution. Halfway through the event, Marcus took his turn to speak. He stepped onto the stage, feeling the eyes of the room upon him, not with hostility but with expectation and curiosity. "Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "When I walked into that bar a few weeks ago, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for all of us, for the idea that we can coexist with respect and dignity regardless of our differences." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I served in the army because I believed in protecting the freedoms that allow each of us to live our lives without fear. But freedom isn't just about defending against external threats. It's about fostering a community where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard. Tonight, we take a step toward that vision by opening our hearts and our minds to one another." As he spoke, Marcus felt a sense of connection with the audience, a shared commitment to the ideals he had fought for. His words seemed to resonate deeply, sparking a renewed sense of purpose among the attendees. The room was filled with a palpable energy, a collective determination to move beyond past grievances and build a more harmonious future. Then, unexpectedly, the door to the community center opened, and in walked one of the bikers from that fateful night, a man named Rick. His presence caused a ripple of tension, a momentary flicker of uncertainty. Rick was older now, his once aggressive demeanor softened by time and reflection. He approached the stage hesitantly, the weight of his previous actions heavy on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Rick stepped forward, meeting Marcus's gaze. "I heard about what happened here," he began, his voice rough but sincere. "And I realized that what we were doing was wrong. I want to apologize, not just to Marcus, but to everyone here. We were lost in our anger and hatred, and it was misguided." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus nodded, offering Rick a compassionate smile. "Thank you for coming, Rick," he replied gently. "Acknowledging that is a brave first step." Rick continued, sharing his own journey of understanding and the aha moments that led him to reassess his beliefs. His vulnerability and honesty touched many in the audience, bridging the gap between past animosities and the possibility of reconciliation. As he spoke, Marcus felt a surge of hope, knowing that change was possible, even for those who had once been entrenched in prejudice. The evening concluded with a renewed sense of unity. Attendees mingled, exchanging contact information, sharing ideas for future initiatives, and committing to continue the conversations that had begun that night. The community center, once a backdrop for tension, had become a beacon of hope and collaboration. As Marcus left the center, the night air felt different, lighter, filled with the promise of a brighter future. He walked home with a heart full of gratitude, knowing that the seeds he had planted were beginning to bear fruit. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the foundation of understanding and respect laid that evening was a testament to the power of one person's courage to inspire change. Under the vast expanse of the star-studded sky, Marcus felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had not only confronted hatred with dignity, but had also ignited a movement toward unity and healing. As he looked up at the twinkling stars, he knew that while the journey was far from over, he had taken a significant step toward creating a more inclusive and compassionate community. With each step forward, guided by justice, personal growth, and redemption, Marcus embraced the hope that a better, more understanding world was within reach. Marcus walked out of the community center that evening feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and hope. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the nearby gardens. The stars were beginning to twinkle in the twilight sky, a serene reminder of the vast possibilities that lay ahead. He glanced back at the building, its windows glowing warmly, now a symbol of unity and understanding rather than a mere venue for conflict. As he made his way down the quiet street, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The confrontation with the bikers in the bar had been a catalyst, a moment that forced him to confront not only his own resilience, but also the deep-seated prejudices that lingered in his hometown. What had begun as a tense standoff had evolved into a movement toward reconciliation, proving that one person's courage could indeed inspire collective change. The following week saw a surge of activity around the community center. The forum had been a resounding success, drawing a diverse crowd eager to engage in meaningful dialogue. Stories flowed freely, bridging gaps that years of silence and misunderstanding had widened. Local businesses sponsored events, schools integrated the forum's principles into their curricula, and veterans like Marcus found new roles as mentors and facilitators. One evening, as Marcus was organizing materials for a follow-up workshop, Emma approached him with a stack of flyers in her hands. "I think it's time we take this to the next level," she suggested, her eyes bright with determination. "What if we start a series of community-led initiatives, maybe volunteer programs, mentorship for at-risk youth, or even cultural exchange events? We've built something here, and it's only going to grow." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, feeling the weight of responsibility mixed with excitement. "I like that idea. We've shown that people are willing to listen and change. Expanding our efforts could make a real difference." Their collaboration became the cornerstone of a series of events aimed at fostering unity and understanding. Tom spearheaded educational workshops, focusing on conflict resolution and empathy building, while Joe took charge of logistical support, ensuring each event ran smoothly. Emma utilized her organizational skills to coordinate volunteers and manage outreach efforts, spreading the word far beyond Greenfield's borders. As the initiatives gained traction, the community began to transform. Neighborhoods that had once been divided by mistrust and prejudice started to knit together through shared experiences and mutual respect. The forum had ignited a spark, and now embers of change were spreading, fueled by the collective efforts of those who believed in a better future. One particularly memorable event was the Cultural Heritage Fair, organized by Emma. The fair showcased the diverse backgrounds of Greenfield's residents, with booths representing different cultures, traditional foods, music, and art. Children participated in storytelling sessions, sharing legends and tales from their heritage, while adults engaged in discussions about the importance of preserving cultural identities while embracing diversity. Marcus watched as the fair unfolded, seeing firsthand the bridges being built between people who had once been strangers or even adversaries. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his actions had set in motion a positive change that would endure long after he had moved on. Amidst the growing harmony, Marcus found himself reflecting on his own journey of personal growth. The confrontation in the bar had been a pivotal moment, pushing him to harness his inner strength and channel it into something greater than himself. He had learned that true courage wasn't just about facing external threats, but also about challenging the internal biases and fears that could divide communities. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Marcus received a call from Captain Reynolds. The captain's voice was warm, tinged with pride. "Marcus, I heard about the progress you've made back home. It's inspiring, son. You're making a real difference." Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. "Thanks, Captain. It's been a challenging but rewarding journey." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing ways the military could support community initiatives and share best practices for fostering unity among veterans and civilians alike. The conversation reinforced Marcus's belief in the power of collaboration and the importance of extending the bonds forged in service to his civilian life. As months turned into years, the initiatives Marcus had helped launch became integral parts of Greenfield's identity. The community center became a hub of activity, a place where people of all backgrounds could come together to learn, share, and grow. The once silent town was now a beacon of hope, demonstrating that even deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome through empathy, understanding, and unwavering commitment to justice. Marcus continued to serve as a mentor and leader within the community, drawing upon his military experiences to guide others in their own journeys toward personal growth and redemption. He often found himself sharing stories of his time in the service, not as tales of battle and bravery, but as lessons in resilience, teamwork, and the enduring human spirit. One evening, during the annual Community Appreciation Night, Marcus stood before a crowd gathered at the community center. The room was filled with familiar faces: Emma, Joe, Tom, and many others who had contributed to the transformation of Greenfield. The air was thick with gratitude and celebration. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began, his voice steady and heartfelt. "When I walked into that bar months ago, I was just looking for peace. What I found instead was a community ready to embrace change and stand up against hatred. Together, we've built something truly remarkable, a community where everyone is valued, respected, and heard." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing the unity Marcus had worked so hard to foster. He looked out at the sea of smiling faces, feeling a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. "This is just the beginning," he continued. "We have the power to continue shaping our community into a place of understanding and compassion. Let's keep this momentum going, supporting each other and celebrating our diversity." As the night drew to a close, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but the rewards were immeasurable. He had found redemption, not through grand gestures or heroic feats, but through the quiet strength to stand up against hatred and inspire others to do the same. Walking home under the starlit sky, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the battle against prejudice and division was ongoing, but he was no longer fighting alone. He had a community that stood with him, a network of individuals committed to making a difference. Together, they would continue to nurture the seeds of change, ensuring that Greenfield remained a place where justice, personal growth, and redemption thrived. As he reached his doorstep, Marcus paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky. The stars shone brightly, each one a symbol of hope and possibility. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs, and smiled. He had faced his fears, confronted hatred, and emerged stronger for it. And in doing so, he had not only transformed his own life, but had also sparked a movement that would inspire others for generations to come. With one last glance at the starry expanse above, Marcus stepped inside, ready to embrace whatever the future held. He knew that true heroism lay not in grand battles, but in the everyday acts of courage and kindness that built bridges and healed wounds. And as he closed the door behind him, he carried with him the unwavering belief that a better, more inclusive world was within reach, and that he had played a part in making it a reality.